Hey everyone, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today I'm going to show you how you can do a little bit of cloud writing. So we're going to be writing with clouds. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how to actually set up your clouds. And second, I'm going to show you how you can actually clone your clouds onto a spline object. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how you can actually animate on the clouds onto and scale up on that spline. So the technique that I'll show you to actually animate on these clouds will help you out in a lot of other Mograph situations. So just how you can scale up along a spline, and it's a lot harder than it seems how to try to figure out. It's a little bit tricky, but I'll show you how you can do that. So first things first, let's set up these clouds. Before I actually begin, I want to go and give a shout out to Hello Lux, Tim Clapham, and he had this really great Pyrocluster cloud tutorial where he shows you how to do how to create all these clouds and really optimize it for speed, and kind of demystifies all of these settings here. So I'm gonna kind of blow through the cloud settings, but know that if you watch Tim's tutorial here, he really helps out in trying to get to understand what all of these weird settings are right here. Alright, so let's get to creating our clouds. And I have a spline here that spells out the word eye, and that's just a sweep NURB with a spline and a circle swept along it. And the one thing to keep in mind when you're creating your spline to clone your clouds onto so you can write a word on, is to just give the spline a little bit of depth. So adjust the spline points on your spline and make sure that none of the parts of the word are kind of overlapping. So if you see what I did in here is that I have the front of the E forward in Z space, and then the back of the E back a little bit in Z space, so this actual tube isn't overlapping. And this also helps give the a little bit subtle depth in Z space when we actually put our clouds onto the spline. So like I said, I'm going to kind of blow through the settings of the clouds because you can actually know everything you need to know from Tim's tutorial here. But the first thing we need to do is create a few shaders to get our clouds into our scene, and that's a pyrocluster, which is what our clouds look like. And then we need to create a volume tracer, which will actually render the clouds in our scene. And the next thing we need to do is create an environment that we can apply our pyrocluster volume tracer shader to. And then the next thing we need to do after that is actually have something where we can actually render the particle geometry in our scene. So we just go to simulate, thinking particles, and just create a particle geometry. And then we're just going to apply our pyrocluster cloud onto that pyrocluster geometry there. Okay, so now we need something to actually define where our clouds are going to clone onto, and what we're going to use for that is a matrix object. So if you use the matrix object enough, you know that you have two settings where you can actually generate matrices or thinking particles. And what we want to create in this instance is thinking particles. So right away we have these thinking particle little plus signs that are in a grid array. So we want to change the mode from grid array to a object, and our object is going to be this cloud text sweep object, or sweep NURB. So let's just go ahead and drag our sweep NURB into our object field here, and you'll see that we have all those pluses now cloned onto our sweep NURB here, onto our sweep NURB geometry. And right now it's set to vertex distribution. We need to just go to surface, and when working with thinking particles you might usually have to update and go to frame zeros for the thinking particles to refresh in your viewport. So keep that in mind. If you're changing something and didn't quite update, always just go back to frame 0, and that should fix that and refresh the thinking particles. So let's go to our count. You can see that we just have 20 of these little thinking particle pluses there. That's not quite enough to form a word here. So let's just jack this up to, say, 700. So now we have pretty good coverage of these thinking particles along this sweep word right here, or over our sweep geometry here. So now if we hit render, you can see that we have a little bit of cloud action going on. Doesn't look too good right now. It kind of looks like Santa Claus's beard or something like that. And we actually first need to just hide from visibility our sweep NURB so it doesn't render. Now hit that again. So you can see that everywhere one of those thinking particle pluses are, a little cloud puff is going to clone, or is going to render where that thinking particle plus is. So what we need to do is, number one, go into our settings and just play around with the size of the clouds and what it looks like as well. So first thing we can do is go into our volume tracer here, and the render mode we can actually just change this to user settings, and Tim from Hello Lux recommends using these settings to really optimize how fast your clouds render in your scene, and I've seen that it actually gives pretty good results regardless that you're actually dumbing down the settings a little bit. But so let me just change our world step size to 15, and that'll speed things up, along with bringing up our ray limit to 5%, our shadow step size to 5, this to 5 as well. Let's see, step size there 10, and ray trace limit to 5. So these are all settings that Tim suggests in his tutorial, and I'm just basically copying it word for word. So like I said, go back to his tutorial and he'll show you why these things do speed things up and do the things they do. And the same thing for the pyrocluster here. Number one, you can change the color, because right now it's just white to white. We can actually change this, go in here and get this nice kind of blue here. So we have this gradation. You can see that update in this little viewer here. We can change our volume to 90, so it's a little bit less, give it a little bit more transparency, give it a little bit more luminance, and just increase the density so it's a little bit more dense of a puff. And age, we're not going to use any age effects, so we're just going to uncheck that. Distance, don't need that. Don't need that distance as well. Shape, we can go in here and just bring it down a little bit. So this use particle TM is very important when you're wanting to work with Mograph effectors with your matrix object to affect these the thinking particles. So without this checked on, effectors are not going to work or affect anything that is produced with thinking particles through the matrix object. With this turned on, you can use effectors, and I'll show you a little bit of that later on, but this is very important to make sure you have enabled, so that when you do apply effectors to your matrix object, it actually affects the thinking particle geometry. So keep that in mind. So very important, make sure that's checked on. So next we're going to go to our illumination options, and I'm just going to turn this on, change it to ray angle. It's a little bit faster render mode, if I remember correctly, and I'm just going to change the self illumination and translucent illumination to 50 and 50. Let's go down to shadow. Let's see, darken opacity, -20, 50 for brightness, and this basically gives it a little bit of contrast. Let's see, I think we're all good there. And then for noise, we can just kind of scale down our noise a little bit so we get a little bit more detail. And maybe bring the detail down a little bit so it renders a little bit faster as well. And phase we're going to come back to. Phase actually animates the turbulence in your cloud, so we'll come back to that later. So we're all good on the cloud settings here, so let's just render and see what that looks like. It's a little bit better. Still need to add lights to our scene, but we'll worry about that later. So the first thing I want to do is, remember I went to that option, that particle TM, and I said that you can use effectors because you're actually, and I just figured this out a while ago, is that you're using a matrix objects to generate all these thinking particles. So I was like, alright, well, you're using a matrix objects. I wonder if, say I wanted to add random size to these clouds, if, you know, would I have to go into Espresso or what? And I was like, well, maybe I'll just try a random effector. And if I go into Mograph random effector and make sure that got applied to my matrix object here, and actually one thing I need to do is go into my Pyrocluster settings, and there's this preview option. So right now you see that by adding that random effector, we now see these matrices from the matrix object. But if I turn on preview, you can actually see these little spheres that represent all of the clouds in our Pyrocluster. So enabling preview allows you to kind of visually see a preview of where your clouds are generally going to be. So let's go into our matrix object again, and our count is 700, but in our max visible view is just set at 100, so we can actually bring this up a little bit so we get a little bit better of an idea of our cloud coverage on our spline here. So like I said, we added our random effector onto our matrix object, and since we have that particle TM checked, we can go to our random effector, and actually position's fine. You can update. Remember, you need to go to frame 0 to update and turn position on, and if we adjust scale and say bring this to 2, you can see that that updates as well. So now we have a random effector randomizing the scale of these clouds as well as the position. And actually, one thing to note when you're dealing with editing the position and affecting the position with effectors is you need to go into your matrix object, and we have this particle priority, and it's set to be 4 effectors. So what this means is that the particles are being generated before effectors are applied. So for our particles to be affected by effectors, we need to change this particle priority to after. So now you see that our particles have now been affected by that random effector. So now if I update this, that random position moves those particles, and then the particles are applied instead of the particles are applied, then the effectors apply, and then the position actually doesn't move the position, just the way that thinking particles work. I don't know much about thinking particles, but that's just what I kind of figured out by going through this. But so you can see that with the position, you need to have the after effectors position on, or particle priority on. Okay. And that's just with position as far as I understand it. So now we have our scale and our random position coming from our random effector, and let's hit render. It's a little bit messy. We need to still kind of mess around and tweak with our cloud settings here because it's all really blown out. But you can see that we have the beginnings of a little bit of a cloud word being spelled out. What we can go and do is either change the radius here in the Pyrocluster settings, or we can go to our scale here and adjust the scale in our random effector as well. So we can bring this down to say 1, and we can also bring down the radius to 60 at the same time. Make sure that's updated. Now you see a lot better that EYE cursive word being spelled out with clouds. So next thing we need to do, and I'll actually handle lighting this last, but we need to animate this cloud word being written on. So like actually the inspiration for this came from the Planes, the Pixar Disney Planes movie, and they actually spell out words with the contrails of the planes, like the plane smoke contrails. So I just want to kind of recreate that as with Mograph Effectors. So the way we can do that and have these basically cloud clones, these little balls of pyroclusters scale on with effectors, is by using a shader object or shader effector. So let's make sure that is applied to our matrix object. And we're actually going to bring this above the random effector in the hierarchy here, just so the shader effector is applied first. And we're going to change the scale to -1. And right away that's probably not going to do anything. There we go. So we have to go back to frame 0 and that will update. So we just changed all of our scale of our pyrocluster clouds to 0. So you don't see any of those little spheres in our scene anymore, because our shader effector is affecting all of them and changing the scale to a -1 or 0. So what we need to do is go into our shader here, our shader channel here, and define a shader that will kind of wipe and animate this on. So all we need to do is animate a gradient that goes from white and then gradually goes all the way to black from the left to right. So let's just go ahead and create a material that does this. So this will be our shader material, and we don't need our specular here. So let's just go ahead and create a gradient. So the first thing you'll notice, let me actually make this a little bit smaller and move this over here. What we need to do first is apply this shader material to the shader, and then in the shader options change the shader channel to color, and then we're just going to drag in that texture that we created with this gradient here. So now you can see this updated a little bit. We have a little bit of randomness going on. It's not what we're wanting right now. But if we go and change the type from 2DU to 2DV and update this, you can see that we have, from left to right, our clouds scaling down from right to left. So we need to actually invert this because we want it to scale up from left to right. So let's invert the knots and then update. So you'll see that whatever is white, that's full scale, and then whatever is black has a scale of 0. So now all we have to do is animate this gradient from right to left. So we're going to do this by just creating a filter. Let me move this down and go into our filter. And all we really need to do is simply adjust our brightness here. So if I brighten this all the way up, brighten our gradient here in update, you'll see that it actually goes backwards. And actually one thing you need to keep in mind is that this is going to work if you do not enable clipping. I'm not sure why this works with the gradient like that, but I think that once you enable clipping, there's nothing higher than 100% brightness. So enabling clipping will kind of clamp everything down so that 100% brightness is just all pure white instead of any other kind of values, or and that's why you kind of saw that scaling on the other end, because I think it went past or kind of looped into black again or something like that. But enable clipping works. I know that much. But so with the brightness all the way up, that means nothing's on, so all the scale is 0. So now what we have to do is animate our brightness. Just go to scale, frame 0, hit brightness, keyframe, and then go to, say, frame 100 here, and bring our brightness all the way down to -100, so we have pure black in as our gradient. And as I kind of play this out, you'll see that we have our little spheres growing on, and you can see in our gradient that our gradient is slowly going black or white to a gradated black coming down, and also that is affecting our clones and scaling them up from left to right with that gradient that we are driving with our brightness here. So if we play this out, you can see that we have our spheres scaling up. So now if we go to, say, right here, we can render this and see how our clouds look as they're being affected by that shader effector. And so we have our clouds fading up and kind of being drawn on like if a plane was flying through here and creating this word with its contrail. So now we have exactly what I have in this final render here, where the clouds scale up and write on this word. So the big revelation is that you can use Mograph effectors with your thinking particles that you create with your matrix object. And you just have to keep in mind that you have to have this use particle TM enabled, so you can actually use those effectors to manipulate these thinking particles that are created by the matrices, created by the matrix object. And if you're changing position or manipulating the position of the thinking particles with an effector, you need to make sure that your particle priority is set to after effectors instead of before effectors, just because of how thinking particles work and when they're generated. So you want them generated after you move them with the effectors. Okay, so let's go ahead and, because our lighting is really cruddy and doesn't look like the final render at all, let's just add some simple lighting in here. And we'll just create a few different lights here. Let's position a light over here, bring the intensity down and give this a little bit of a blue hue to it. Just get a little sky blue light here. And we'll change the shadow to an area shadow just because it has way sexier shadows than the other ones. We'll just duplicate this light and bring a light over up in this corner here. And we'll just jack up the intensity there a little bit, maybe get a little bit less blue. And then we'll create another light and we'll bring it behind our text here and give it a little yellow hue. So say the sun's like coming from the left here, so we'll give this a little bit of yellow orangish hue and bring this down a little bit, so it's just a little subtle effect. And let's see what we got now. So it's looking a little bit better. We can play around with our lights a little bit more. Let's bring this corner light up a little bit and down, increase that intensity a little bit, and bring this light down, bring it a little bit more intensity. Same thing with this guy down here. Get a little bit lighter blue. Let's see what that does. So that's a little bit better. What I do want to do is actually bring up the randomness a little bit more. So let's just scale up our randomness to 2. And I want to change the random mode from random to noise, and change the space from global to UV. And we don't need any animation speed at all. We can adjust the scale. I just like to use a different random mode, because you can actually have a little bit more control over your noise. So now we have a little bit more flowy kind of turbulence as you're scaling up the turbulence or the noise. So this looks pretty good right there. So let's see what we have now. It's looking a little bit better. I think we might have to move this light up a little bit and maybe rotate it a little bit here. Bring this light down. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. It's getting there, but I'm not gonna spend all day. You can play around with lights all you want to get it looking the way you want. The one final thing I do want to do, well, 2 things, and one is you can see that as these kind of fade on, they kind of pop a little bit suddenly. If we want to ease that a little bit, all we have to do is, remember, we're just using effectors, is just add a delay effector and bring our blend strength up. Make sure that applied to our matrix object here. Yep. So now you can see that we have our clouds scale up a little bit more softly and ease in, and don't just pop in just mechanically. So now we have a little bit more organic scaling up to our clouds. And the second thing you can actually add is, if you notice, it's very subtle, but we have a little bit of our clouds turbulence moving a little bit. So we have a little bit of the cloud turbulence animating. You can see right here that the turbulence is moving just so subtly, and we can adjust that by going into our pyrocluster and going into our noise and just animating this phase value. So I'm going to go to frame 0, hit a keyframe, go to frame 120, and I've found that about 1% of frame gives you a pretty subtle look. So let's just do 120%, and then just go into our timeline and make sure we have our phase selected. Yeah, and we'll just make that a linear keyframe so we don't have ease in and ease out. And we can actually do that with our filter gradient, the brightness of our gradient, so it's not easing in and easing out, it's just more linear. And we'll let the delay effector handle the easing in and easing out of the actual scale. Alright, so we've learned how to create some clouds, clone clouds onto a spline, or a sweep nerve here, and then we've learned that we can actually use Mograph effectors with thinking particles that are generated with matrix objects. And we also learned that we can use a shader effector to affect clones linearly along a spline by using the UV settings in the shader settings, and then animating that shader by animating the brightness of that gradient. So a lot of really handy tips in here. I'm going to provide this scene for a download, and I'd really like to see what you guys can come up with. Write out your names, whatever, post it, let me see what you did, and I'm anxious to see what you guys come up with. And I'll see you next time. Bye.